but we have a long way to go on Black and Latinx progress. One particular program that I'm really excited to launch in May, which we have not done before, is the Bloomberg Media Fellows Program. We have found 5 amazing young students, or young graduates, who will join us for a year. We have exclusively sourced from historically Black and Latinx and Hispanic communities, or colleges and universities. And my aim with that program is that all of them have a permanent job after that one-year fellowship, and that we build a much bigger program, one that can rival any fellowship program in media. Like you, we understand the importance of building a workplace that sees our differences as our greatest strengths. We recognize DE&I as more than an element of our HR strategy, but actually as the foundation for everything that we build going forward. We hope you'll continue to join us in our efforts to prioritize the business of equality. Those in this room and those watching truly have the power to make real change and help sustain it. Let's remember to consistently challenge ourselves with the question of now what? Thank you so much, and have a wonderful summit.
Please welcome to the stage Latino Corporate Directors Association CEO, Esther Aguilera. Former Ford Foundation President, Luis Ubiñas, and Bloomberg's Jim Ellis.
Thank you. And this is a pretty exciting day for us, and I know that our time is short, so we're going to jump right in. One of the things that you hear all the time is the way that businesses are becoming more and more diverse, and that business is changing. It's not the business that that I was raised on 20, 30, 40. We won't go how long ago. But at the same time, when you start looking at the way the numbers have been shifting in recent years, you notice that a lot of what they're saying is based on an extremely small base, and also that it's maybe not as sort of upbeat as we all think. Particularly when it comes to the boardrooms, where a lot of the center of power within companies. And so one of the things we're going to talk about today is obviously, how Latinos are fitting into that, and sort of what needs to be done, and how much progress are we really making. And so just to get us started, Esther, I wanted to ask, we hear a lot about the numbers, but when you think about it, corporate boardrooms are still overwhelmingly male. They're overwhelmingly white. What happened? Why have we seen such low representation among Latinos? I mean, I guess it's about 3% of boardroom seats right now, even in a time when people are saying, everybody's made it and now we're moving ahead.
Well, you're right, Jim. We are far behind, and the numbers are dismal. This is what I see. I look through hundreds of proxy statements and view thousands of board profiles and pictures. It's a sea of white. Yet, and here are the facts, still 85% of Russell 3000 company board seats are held by whites. Latinos are a mere 2.3% of the Russell 3000. Yet at the same time, this is 20% of the population, and there is ample talent. So we have quite a ways to go.
Now, when corporate boards meet, I mean, we sort of think of these sort of hallowed halls or country clubs or wherever that things like that happen. So, Luis, I wanted to ask, because you're a veteran director. I mean, you've an director at AT&T, you're a lead director at Electronic Arts. You are the guy here who has been in those discussions about, what can we do, or what should we do, or maybe we don't want to do anything about being more diverse, and particularly about having more Hispanic representation at a time when Hispanics are 18% of the U.S. population and the fastest growing part of the population. It sort of seems weird that wouldn't be discussed. Is it discussed?
So you have to understand that the absence of Latinos and Latinas in boardrooms and C-suites is so profound that many boardrooms and C-suites, I don't think, fully understand the strategic failing that represents. They literally don't understand. Half the growth in the country, half the economic growth of the country is driven by Latina and Latina households. When someone isn't in the conversation at all, it's hard for them to come up in the conversation. This has to be fixed. It has to be fixed not because it's an equality issue, but because companies can't persist in a world where half of future growth is going to come from one demographic and have no voices from that demographic anywhere in leadership.
Well, are people actually within boardrooms, are they listening to what customers are saying, or are they listening to what investors are saying about greater diversity, or does it have to basically come from the people who are in that room who just make a decision, we want to change?
So decisions are made in ecosystems. Those ecosystems include all those constituencies. Okay. But when the ecosystems lack at all levels, in the media, in the boardroom, among the advisors, the law firms, the investment banks, when the ecosystem is effectively devoid of Latino and Latina voices, it's very hard for the customers who are at the vanguard of understanding Latino-ness and Latina-ness because they're the ones spending the money. Yeah. It's very hard for those voices to be heard when there's no one in those rooms who can hear them, who understands them natively, who grew up in the culture and understands the culture. Until we get critical mass in those boardrooms, we're not going to see the kind of understanding of the strategic imperative of addressing the Latino and Latina community that is just simply an economic requirement in this next generation.
You know, one voice that has been helping are the institutional investors and pension funds who are the shareholders. It wasn't until they started speaking up about the business value that this conversation is even happening. But even with those voices, we're still seeing that it's not bubbling up. Latinos are being left behind, and yet there's ample talent. So there was a new survey by KPMG just last month that found that 30% of directors still believe that the barrier for them, the hurdle for them to get more diversity on the boards, is lack of talent. Okay. That is a huge misconception.
Now, speaking of that misconception, I know one of the things that the Latino Corporate Board Association has been doing is looking to make sure that they can identify people who companies could consider for board membership, and also sort of helping develop executives along the way so that they will be prime candidates in the future. Tell us a little about that effort.
Thank you. Yes, so the Latino Corporate Directors Association is part of the solution and a resource. We were formed by corporate directors and have a group of experienced directors as well as executives that are C-suite, P&L leaders, and those that are ready to serve on boards today that we're helping out. And by the way, we are a trusted partner and support search firms, companies, private equity to tap the talent. Mm-hmm. So we're part of the solution and the resource because this is the first time we're bringing together the most accomplished and experienced Latinos in corporate governance and leadership. So we're taking away the excuse that they can't find talent.
And let's just be clear. There are 3,000 Russell 3000 companies. The idea that there aren't 3,000 exquisitely qualified Latina and Latino leaders in this country qualified to be on boards is, on a prima facie basis, ridiculous. Okay, well, let's stay with that.
Luis, do you find that sometimes, since boards have traditionally been chosen by the nominating committees there, often with the heavy finger placed by the CEO, or sometimes if there's a very large investor or things like that, is there pushback when people from outside are saying your board should be more representative of the public that it serves, and also recognize that diverse talent sort of brings diverse ideas, which hopefully will bring better solutions on the long part? Do people suddenly say, that's not your place to tell us how to operate in this room?
I've seen a huge change on that issue in the last decade. In the last few years, I've seen an almost universal questioning of how can we persist in lack of diversity. I think people are beginning to understand that lack of diversity is a failing, a lost opportunity. In particular, in the Latino and Latina community, which is so far behind every other group, I think that they look around the room and understand that that room now looks too different from what their customers look like.
Okay.
And so the good news on that is I don't think it's no longer an unwelcome question.
Now, is the, well, we'll come back. One of the things that I've always thought about, whether it's senior management, whether it's boards, is that a lot of, sort of the way it's populated often is determined by backgrounds, networks, things like that, that people consider to be, this is the path that I would like to have seen you follow. And, whether that is school networks, whether that's, you've got a certain type of corporate experience, whether it's academic, you came from an academic standpoint, or whether, consulting, I know you came from, you were a partner at McKinsey, whether it's in government, I know you worked in government with the Hispanic caucus, the Congressional caucus. I mean, are people opening up on what they consider to be the kinds of backgrounds that a Hispanic executive would need to have to be a corporate director, Esther?
Well, I would answer that in two ways. One is you don't have to substitute one for the other. There is ample talent that has deep industry and functional expertise and brings that additional perspective. So that's on the one hand.
Okay.
What we are seeing as well in tracking who's getting on boards, of the Latinos that are getting on boards, half are first-time directors. So we are seeing the aperture open up more beyond CEOs, COOs, CFOs. That's a good trend.
Okay.
And we're seeing a slight uptick for Latinas. But I will say for Latinas, they are, of any group, the least represented, with less than 1% on corporate boards. And yet they're entrepreneurial. They are driving business growth. And it is the group that really needs more attention. It has to be intentional.
Okay, I want to stay on that point, though. Luis, the notion of what are the qualities that people are most interested in, obviously it varies from company to company, but is it the sort of functional experience within within the company's own industry, or are people looking for broader thinking in the boards you've been on?
So who you want to add to a board changes depending on who you already have. If you think of it, it's about developing the right mix. So you might find yourself in a situation where what you need is someone who has mergers and acquisitions experience, because the board already has deep industry experience. Or you might need someone who has deep finance experience because your audit chair might be retiring. Okay. So, but to mirror what Esther said, we now have such a deep reservoir of Latino and Latina talent scattered all over the country. Thousands of qualified candidates, CFOs, CIOs, et cetera, that the idea that you can't find, regardless of your need, a qualified Latino or Latina candidate is absurd.
Okay, so
Jim, I love numbers, but if you look at that Fortune 1000, Latinos hold 380 board seats. That adds up to less than 250 individuals, when in fact there's thousands. We have the numbers. It ranges from 4,000 to 50,000 who, could qualify for those seats. Okay. That's how wide this gap is.
Are there established networks of people who are suggesting, other people who are already on board suggesting people? I mean, are there networks there that people can call on? Are you working with networks?
Yeah, well, that's what we have formed, is a network. And so we've had a breakthrough year last year, making some gains. Still a drop in the bucket because we have such a wide gap to close. But we helped with about 219 board search requests. And so more people that find out about us and find the deep talent, one, they see the value once they open their, and contact us for it. And we're seeing more people interviewed. It's a change just as recently as last year.
But I have to say, there are two major barriers to your question, to an answer to your question. One is that the search firms operate almost exclusively within the ecosystem of who they know. And because the search firms are Latino-free zones, they, of course, don't know any Latinas or Latinos to recommend. And so, barring their awakening and understanding that the future cannot be as the past, not for equality reasons, but for pragmatic business reasons, the search firms will continue to perpetuate the inequality you all have been speaking about all day. And then, of course, they're the boards themselves, because, of course, people operate within their networks. And when your network is not aware that the demographics of the country have changed profoundly in the last 2 decades, you're not going to be able to develop the kinds of readily available Latino and Latina candidates who you should.
You know, and our membership is committed to paying it forward and opening the doors for not only new people coming in, but for each other. And that's one of the types of networks you're talking about. Yeah.
Now, one of the things that when I talk to business people about diversity, one of the things they always point to is, well, you know, once upon a time, this was a boys' club, and it's not a boys' club anymore. So, but I'm curious, has so much, is it sort of easier for, you know, sort of corporations to say, I'm going to deal with my gender issue first, and it's because it's a lot less familiar to me to deal with sort of ethnic issues as far as diversity is concerned?
Well, look, there is room at the table for us all. And just going back to what Luis said, it's about, you know, directors have a fiduciary duty to the shareholders and stakeholders. And if you're working with 75% of your team and leaving out 25%, you're at a disadvantage. You are leaving money on the table. In fact, I know a lot of McKinsey reports have been brought up, but they just released a report in December that found that, you know, we're leaving trillions of dollars, $3 trillion on the table for kind of really, like, there's a market here to be grown and developed. You know, if you go to another country to develop a market, you have a market plan. That hasn't been done here with a market that is in our backyard.
Well, we've talked a lot about what companies might want to do or do themselves. I'm curious what your own thought, Luis, is about like the California approach with SB 826 that says, that there should be certain sort of diversity goals that need to be, sort of mandated. Is that something that we have to move toward, or is that a view within companies as something that's counterproductive?
I think as a last resort, these mandates end up being beneficial, but it is, I think, a failing of the system that one has to mandate something that is a strategic imperative. Okay. The idea that I have to force you through a mandate to do the thing that is going to drive your growth in the future just seems like a profound failing on the part of the people who are supposed to be building shareholder value. Yeah, I shouldn't have to force you.
I have to tell you that basically the market of the future is something you should pay attention to.
You would think.
Yes.
The market of today.
Okay. Now, I know that, it seems sort of maybe corny to say, we make, I feel good about progress we're making, but I just want to ask you, do you feel that we're making enough progress here? I mean, do you feel hopeful that, 5 years from now, the same sort of, small changes that we've seen in the last couple of years will be magnified and that we'll be looking at something different? I'm just curious.
Well, we need to have some real honest and courageous conversations.
Yeah.
We did a poll, a public opinion poll with other Latino business leaders and consumer groups, and found that, Americans believe that a third of Latinos are undocumented, when in fact 90% of Latinos are, 80% are citizens, 90% are citizens and legally here. So it's a huge misnomer. The second striking finding is that Americans view Latinos as half of us are laborers, farm workers, your gardeners. And yet, so they don't, I think this leads to a lot of conscious and unconscious bias, both for Latinos building their careers in the workplace and having that pipeline for the boardroom. I'm going to just give you a couple of quick examples because I know we're, closing in on time. But, I hear from a lot of Latino and Latina executives. One Latina grew her portfolio to $2 billion. And yet still when she walks into some rooms, they ask her to clean the tables. It's very true. Look, these polls and perceptions, that's happening today. So we have to be conscious that your perceptions drive what you value.
Okay. Now, Luis, what would you tell someone who was, let's say, a young person who was a young Latino or Latina who was going into the business world about what can they do?
So I happen to have a son who's starting at Harvard Business School in just a few months.
Okay.
And I answer that question to him all the time. And I tell him that there's an inevitability to his success, collectively, his generation's success. Because inevitably, when you're half of economic growth, when you're 26% of the population, which is what the Latino and Latina share is below 25, inevitably, society is going to have to pay attention to you. The question is, when?
Okay. Well, both of you, thank you so much. I would love to continue the discussion, but the clock has ticked on us. Thank you again. Thank you all. Thank you. Go right there. I think we go back this way.
Please welcome to the stage New York Stock Exchange Chair, Commissioner Sharon Bowen, and President of the NYSE Group and Chair of ICE Fixed Income and Data Services, Lynn Martin, and Bloomberg's Lisa Abramowitz.
I'd like to welcome everybody and thank everybody for being here. It is so wonderful to have an in-person event. I am surprised, actually, at how nice it is. I am so pleased to introduce our two guests, Sharon Bowen, who became Chair and Commissioner of NYSE back in late last year, as well as Lynn Martin, who has been in the seat of president of NYSE for 2 months, she informed me, and has been heading the ICE initiative for a lot longer than that. We're talking about companies that want to adopt ESG nomenclature, that want to comply with it, and also in terms of investors and the reliability of some of those designations. So I just wanted to start with, just to get started with what some of the biggest advances have been in the ESG designation and how companies comply with it. And Sharon, I want to start with you in terms of the biggest changes that you have seen over the past couple of years in how companies approach this.
Well, first, thank you so much for having me. It's been almost exactly 3 years to the date that I was here speaking about gender lens investing, when that was sort of a cliche. And it was a time when people were like, this ESG thing, that's just a fad, right? I was like, no, I think it's got legs. So the good news is it has long, long legs, and it really has evolved. I mean, it's something that companies care about, their employees care about, regulators care about it. I think just it's evolved in a really good way.
And Lynn, how many companies have struggled to comply and turned to tools? I know that you're, for example, on the advisory board for dealing with trying to diversify some of the boards at times when companies come to you and say, we can't find people. Yeah. So how exactly do you go about that?
Yeah, so thank you again for having me today. I agree with your sentiment. That's wonderful to see so many people in person. The way we like to describe what we offer at the NYSE is we offer a variety of tools that help customers embark on their ESG journey. Their ESG journey, as you point out, Lisa, could be adding diverse candidates to their board, which we offer a service called the Board Advisory Council, which Sharon is one of the chairs of. Started in 2019, focused on about 30 of our listed company CEOs nominating diverse candidates that they can personally refer, personally vouch for into a database. Our database now has grown to about 300 different diverse candidates, sorted by what their expertise is. Are they a financial expert? Do they have nom and gov experience? Things of that nature. And that really allows our listed community to pull from a database of pre-approved, pre-vetted, diverse candidates that they can very easily add to their board in a variety of different disciplines. It's already resulted in 20 placements of the 300 people that we have in our database. But it really hasn't stopped there. We've continued to evolve our services. We just announced our Sustainability Council, which is going to be a new council for us. It's going to really help the emerging and increasingly important voice in the C-suite, which is the Chief Sustainability Officer, develop tools, practices, share information around their own disclosures, particularly with some of the regulations that are coming out, which we know is going to be important for the listed company community.
Okay, so let's start with some of the new regulations, since, as Sharon said, it's hot off the presses. You're hearing it here, not first, but very close to first. On Monday, we were talking about how the SEC released some of the designations and the guidelines for how they would like companies to report certain standards having to do mostly with the environment, I believe. What do you expect the response to be? It's now in a comment period. What do you expect the response to be from investors and, frankly, from companies?
I expect the response to be really robust, as it should be.
Which is code for.
Exactly. I mean, there is at least a 2-month comment period, and that's part of the process. I know as a former regulator, I always appreciated getting different viewpoints. And I think it makes for much better decision making. And so we look forward to engaging our listed companies. As you know, everyone's at different stages in the ESG journey. You know, there's no one size that fits all. And so we really look forward to engaging our listed companies, their customers, regulators, working with the commission. As they work through that process.
Well, as is, Lynn, how standardized have some of the criteria become, especially if people want to feel like the E and the S and the G are actually the E and the S and the G?
Yeah, and that's been one of the big challenges, the standardization around reporting. But if you look at the proposed regulation that came out requiring Scope 1, Scope 2, Scope 3 emission disclosure, and we look at our community of listed companies, which we like to think we have the most thoughtful, best governed, most entrepreneurial companies, 81% of that large cap company group is already disclosing what was proposed in the rulemaking, meaning firms have already embarked on the journey of figuring out how to disclose Scope 1, Scope 2, Scope 3 type greenhouse gas emissions. It was something that the largest, most well-governed, most thoughtful companies were already in the process of thinking about how to put into the electronic universe, mainly because the investor base over the last 2 years have been voting with their investment dollars and believing in those companies who are disclosing, who are giving transparency, and who are doing the right things in terms of the environmental, social, and governance pillars.
Sharon?
And I would just add to that, too. I mean, most of these companies are global companies. And regulators across the globe have asked for disclosure in many different ways. So that's another reason why many of our companies are already further along in that journey.
Are these criteria, Sharon, encouraging or discouraging companies from going public?
Depends on who you ask that question, to be honest with you. I'm a big fan of transparency and giving investors the information that they deem to be material when they make an investment decision. At the same time, I want more companies to be listed. I'm a big believer in transparent markets because we know what happens when we have dark, opaque markets. As a former regulator going through, the Great Recession, it's not a good market when you can't see what's happening. And so transparency is not only just good for everyone, but it brings trust back into the marketplace and credibility. It makes our markets much more efficient.
Well, are you concerned about some of the less visible areas of the market, whether it's private equity or private investing, that are purposely trying not to comply with some of these aspects going forward, given that there's been so much money raised there?
I wouldn't say that they're intentionally trying to avoid the laws. I wouldn't characterize it. They're just not subject to them.
Right.
That's not to say that private equity companies aren't cognizant of the fact that investors care about these issues, and some of them, in fact, are providing board diversity and those types of things. So I don't see it as an either or. But I definitely want more.
And I would say many private equity companies are encouraging disclosures before a company goes public, particularly their largest portfolio companies. I think what a private company needs to do from a disclosure standpoint, there's a machine that has to go behind that. So they have to get the machine ready. And a lot of the companies that we're talking about coming public in the near-term future are really excited to tell their ESG story. Many of them preemptively launch sustainability reports prior to becoming a public company now.
Lynn, we're at a tenuous moment for some of these categorizations with the Ukrainian war and what's been happening with suddenly this focus on domestic production of oil and gas in the United States, a shift away from Russian sources, and this feeling that perhaps there is a social purpose to supporting certain companies that people previously had been stepping away from. How quickly, how dynamic are some of these indexes? How much do you get questions about these types of issues?
Yeah, on the index side, on the ICE side of the business, we do get questions, and what we do is consistent with IOSCO principles, consistent with benchmark regulation principles. We go out and consult with our market participants. We follow a formal consultation process, and based on the results of that formal consultation process, will tell us should we remove an entity from a set of indices or should we keep it in. We just recently announced that we were on the ICE side of the business removing Russian entities, both from our fixed income and our equity index platform, and that was following such a consultation. And I know a lot of the other index providers follow similar processes. Very transparent process.
How dynamic is it, though? I mean, how frequently are those assessments done?
They're done pretty much any time there's news and pretty much any time there's a significant amount of market volatility, like we saw in March of 2020. We followed a robust consultation process in March of 2020 about what to do with rebalancing our indices, whether it was the right thing to do for the market or would it add stress to the market in March of 2020, and we opted not to for that reason on the fixed income side, because we thought it would just add too much stress based on the results we received. This process that we followed and all the other index providers followed was a very similar process. We saw the sanctions, we saw the actions taken by the exchanges, including the NYSE, who was the first exchange to halt Russian securities, following the sanction imposition last weekend in February. And based on the results and based on what our peer group was doing, we made the decision that it was the right thing to do to remove those sanctioned entities, not just sanctioned entities, but Russian entities as quickly as possible.
Commissioner, when you take a look at the companies desiring to comply and trying to, yes, it's born out of this flood of money going into these designations, but what are the conversations like when you talk with them about how much their performance can improve, what it can actually do for their resilience or their bottom line?
So the good news is there's data out there. I mean, there was a point in time when there was a question as to whether, for example, diverse corporations or companies that had diverse boards, whether they perform better. The good news is the data's there, lots of studies that kind of show that. In addition, I think companies understand that they've got different stakeholders that they have to address. So it's not just the investing public, although that's obviously the most important one in many respects, but it's also the people who walk in every day, the employees, it's the communities where they work every day. And so the idea of being a good corporate citizen, I think, is embedded in a number of companies. And I think, particularly the last 2 years, the ESG, the SG part of it, companies are responding to things. How can we make our universe a better place?
What's the data point that you like to look at to talk with companies to really explain the bottom line benefit other than just, it feels right?
Well, stock prices is one good indicator of, of a company's, the stock price tells you a lot about what the market is saying. I mean, that's the good news about, transparency, is that you've got people who have opinions about whether this is a good thing or a bad thing, and will make their investment decisions, accordingly. That's not to say that, markets go up and they go down, and they do so, often for a reason, because of uncertainty in the marketplace. But I do look at the markets. I mean, not just because I chair the board of the New York Stock Exchange.
Because of your role.
Yeah, not just because of that. But it does, whether it's inflation rate environments or the news of the day or war of the day, that uncertainty creates volatility in our markets, which is why, I'm proud of the fact that we've got the technology and the human judgment to make our markets a lot more resilient and a lot more transparent.
What kind of performance differentials do you point to on an index level? Because I know that that's something a lot of people have looked at when the market has grown. I was looking at some statistics, and at the end of 2018, for example, things have surged. I mean, it was insane, right? It was like a 42% increase in 1 year from 2018 to 2019.
So one of the many interesting fact points I like to use is during the pandemic, when there was a ton of volatility in the market, you saw about 30% outflows out of your standard equity funds. You saw 5% inflows into ESG-driven funds in the height of volatility, in the height of the pandemic. To me, the silver lining of the pandemic was it really put a finer point on the returns that can be driven by portfolios that include ESG risk metrics.
So, Lynn, when it comes to index construction, what's been your biggest concern about how things are working in terms of either consistency or the greenwashing or whatever people take a look at and have sort of tried to poke holes in because that's what they do?
I guess one of the challenges with indices is to really how to build your constituent universe and what to use on the ESG side as either filtering criteria or as weighting criteria. Filtering criteria is a determination of what actually goes into the index versus what doesn't go into the index. Weighting criteria is a bit more subjective. It tends to be how much a particular stock, in an oversimplification, receives as a weight within the index, if it's something that's more environmentally focused or more governance focused. On the latter, that tends to be more subjective because there are a variety of scores in the market. And there's still a lot of discrepancy when you look at the various scores that go into the market. So you really need to talk to a customer to really understand what type of exposure they're looking to achieve for and whether it's something that can be solved by more objective filtering criteria, which is more transparent what's put out in the universe, as opposed to something that's more weightings-based.
And Commissioner, from your perspective when dealing with companies, I wonder how effective some of the measures have been. Where have you found problems in terms of either retention of women and people of color in prominent seats, or whether it's, compliance with certain environmental criteria that are changing quickly? Are there any areas that you really find companies struggle with?
All of the above.
Okay.
Pretty much. We've got room for improvement. I mean, we've made progress. Don't get me wrong, we've made tremendous progress, and we're all moving in the right direction. And I'm a problem solver, and so as Lynn mentioned, one of the reasons we created the Board Advisory Council was to create a database so people couldn't say, well, we can't find women, we can't find qualified minorities to serve on boards. And so knowing that, for example, the referral process is how most board seats are found. It's like you ask someone, and they ask someone, and they ask someone. So we said, we've got the brand of the New York Stock Exchange, we've got the CEOs. Recommend someone that's board ready, someone you will vouch for that can sit on a board today. So that's one of the ways we decided to solve for an issue, was to provide our listed companies with a source and a resource.
Are there any other steps like that that you foresee in the offing?
Of course.
Okay.
We're going to continue to make progress, obviously. And I think, as Lynn mentioned, in terms of ESG, we do need some sort of standardization because it's sort of an apples and oranges situation. And so I do look forward to working with companies to decide what those standards would look like.
And one thing, Lynn, this is sort of my wheelhouse, so I have to ask you about this. But I know that when you took over the ICE units and then the index business, that has a lot of a fixed income, and a lot of people are wondering how this all translates into fixed income disclosure, especially because a lot of these companies are not public. And how do you standardize it in the same kind of way? What kinds of progress has there been on that front?
Yeah, I would say that it depends on the asset class in fixed income. You think about an asset class like munis, for example. not a lot of disclosure in the muni universe. Not a lot of disclosure full stop in the muni universe, be it financials or ESG type of information. We've attempted to layer on some of that with a service that we have, which looks at climate risk, specifically tying that to municipalities so they're not obliged to disclose. We're able to measure things like wildfire risk, things of that nature, down to an individual municipal security level. So it allows us to create indices on the fixed income side of the business without requiring a municipality, for example, to disclose. If you look at something like an investment grade index or a high yield index, a lot of times there is disclosed information because a lot of those companies are public entities. So those tend to be a little bit easier. And as more and more companies are embarking on their disclosure journeys, you'll see those types of indices get more refined. Those types of benchmarks that folks are looking to mark their portfolio against. That'll get more refined as disclosure improves.
More broadly, Lynn, when you talk about ESG indexes, how much is this catering in some ways to a younger investor group? Because I think about, the institutional investors have voting rights. They can affect change in other ways if they want to. Pensions can do it their way. How much is this really the millennial, if I want to use a cliche, and others?
Clearly, retail is playing an interesting role in that, but it very much is on the mind of the institutional user. We get asked about that as a public company all the time. I can't tell you the number of investor meetings that I'm in that are starting to go along the ESG type questions. For example, we're quite proud at ICE that following our next annual general meeting, we'll have 60% female directors. That's something that will come up in our investor meetings going forward.
I would add, out of that 6, 3 of us are women of color, which is a great thing.
And Commissioner, I wonder from your perspective, do you find that companies ever get frustrated that the E, the S, and the G are lumped together because they feel like they're each distinct issues that they try to address in very different ways?
I get frustrated that they're linked together, to be honest with you.
Because they are very different.
Because they are really
very
different. They're really different things.
But we're lumping it all together, and I feel like it stays very superficial. And how much do you sort of dive in?
Well, again, for some companies, they're going to be more focused on the E, some on the S, and some on the G. I think for the most part, the governance is the easiest part for companies to be focused on. Societal sounds a little bit too wishy-washy for companies, and so for them, it's deciding like what's really important to the investor, what's really important to our employees, what would make a better customer, a better product. And so I think it's really evolving, if you will, and maybe ESG will become, I don't know, XYZ, next week, and be some other nomenclature that's more indicative. And I do think, with data, it informs decision making. Before people would speculate as to the effects of things, I think data is something that people really can respond to when you can look at real numbers, if you can look at KPIs that make sense. So I see it really kind of evolving, and so.
When you talk about the social and the fact that some people look at it and they're saying, it's wishy-washy, how much does this stem from this sort of, washing everything in a political brush rather than digging in and understanding what aspects of a company can actually make them perform better, make them have more resilience?
So I don't see S as being a political issue, to be honest with you. I mean, S is about the talent pool. Like, who would you like to hire? Wouldn't you want to hire the smartest people in the room? They're going to include women and people of color. Wouldn't you want to produce products that are safe for people? They're more likely to buy those products. And so I don't really kind of view these in political terms. It's more of what's best for our communities, what's best for our employees. How do we retain talent? And how do we make our markets much more efficient and visible to people?
Lynn, what do you think will be the biggest advancement on the index side going forward, given the fact that there is so much money flooding in? How big do you think they're going to get, and how will they be fine-tuned as we talk about XYZ instead of ESG?
I mean, I think the trend is there where you're seeing more and more money come into these types of investments. I'm hoping in 10 years from now, this is just a standard conversation as opposed to a discrete panel on ESG as just a standard type of philosophy that customers follow. So it's hard to say because you also see the dynamic of more and more money flooding into fixed income to your point earlier. But there's still a tremendous amount of money flowing into equities as thematic equities continue to gain relevance. So,
Commissioner, before we wrap up, I would love your sense of what companies should know as they embark on that sort of soul-searching process of how to be more compliant and how to be a better company.
So I'm a big believer in sharing best practices, which is why I really believe in collaboration. And so I would tell companies that you're not alone in this journey. Like, no one has this perfectly. Some of you may be doing a better job than others, but we can learn from those companies that are doing better at some things but not others. And so again, I see that evolving along the continuum as people become a little bit more educated, as investors want more information, as data informs us as well. So I really do see this as a journey.
And anything to add?
yeah, I would just echo Sharon's comments around transparency and sharing information. One of the services that we run within ICE, which is very popular with our NYSE issuer community, is our ESG reference data database, which I like to characterize as a company's electronic ESG footprint. So what that does is it provides 400 different attributes roughly around environmental, social, and governance factors. But it's all quantitative based. It's what companies put in their sustainability reports. It's what they put on their websites about ESG. How many female directors, what's your average board tenure, things of that nature. What that allows a company to do is look at their peer group for who are the best performers. And they can see what that peer group is putting out. They can also see what some of their suppliers are putting out, which is going to help with their Scope 3 disclosures. So that's a great way for a company that is thinking about going public to get a crash course on what ESG disclosures really mean from folks who have evolved for hundreds of years as listed companies on the NYSE.
Well, I just want to thank you all, and especially you both for being with us. It was fantastic, and good luck.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you,
Take
guys.
care.
Please welcome to the stage Responsible Business Initiative for Justice founder and CEO Celia Ouellette, and Galaxy Digital founder and CEO and chairman of the Bail Project, Michael Novogratz, and Bloomberg's Jennifer Zabasaja.
Well, thank you all for being here. Celia, Mike, thank you both so much for sitting down with me. When I was thinking about this panel, I was thinking you two are the best people to talk to about sort of this convergence between criminal justice reform and also the business aspect of it. I wanted to start in New York specifically because we are in New York and you both are doing a lot of work here in New York. And specifically look at what the public sector is doing. Governor Kathy Hochul has a lot of initiatives out there. Is that progress? Are we headed in the right direction? Are we talking about this in the right way? Mike, do you want to start?
Sure. Listen, I mean, just step back for a second, right? I got in criminal justice reform 5 years ago. And at that point, it was a real uphill battle. And there were guys like Brian Stevenson and Robin Steinberg and local advocates all pushing this story that the system was unfair, unjust, racially biased, mean-spirited, and uneconomic. And the good news is that argument won the day. And, with George Floyd especially, you had this shift in momentum where I think everybody said, yeah, we need to fix this. And so that's awesome news, and we shouldn't forget that. Post-George Floyd, a few things happened, right? The progressive side of the movement probably got carried away with things like defund the police, maybe the four worst words that ever happened in criminal justice reform. Prison abolition, good idea, bad vocabulary. And a combination of the far right weaponizing those words and the rise in violent crime in cities. Now, what's interesting is you saw a rise in violent crime in New York City, but you saw it where we had bail reform and criminal justice reform, but you saw it in almost every city in America, depending if they had reform or not. The ideas got, conflated, and that's been a problem. And so since then, right, criminal justice reform has been on its back foot. Governor Hochul has been pretty good at trying to hold the line, but the state legislator, the state Senate, even though it's democratically controlled, is feeling a tremendous amount of pressure to roll back some of these reforms, right? Mayor Adams got elected on saying, I'm going to make the city safe. And so what I think needs to happen, and is starting to happen, is the criminal justice reform story has to lead with safety first. What's not intuitive, but is fact, is that in places where we do good criminal justice reform, when you do bail reform, cities are actually safer. That feels counterintuitive, but the facts line up. If you take people and you erase their record, right? The Clear Act bill, right? You erase their record, they're far less likely to go back to jail and commit crimes. And so what we're pushing for and what we need is smart criminal justice reform going forward. But right now we've got to kind of win the narrative back, and the narrative and the politics are pushing back the other direction.
Celia, talk more about what Mike was just speaking about, the clean slate bill, which is something that has been floated a lot, which not only is just about sort of your records, but also could tie into the private sector and into the workforce. Can you just expand on that, especially because you talk to businesses all the time?
Yeah, so our work is working exclusively in the criminal justice reform space, and all we do is work with businesses, and so much of it is because of what Mike just said. We need businesses to help us kind of clamp down the lid and turn up the heat when it gets harder to achieve change. So what Clean Slate, this is a great example of this, right? So what Clean Slate is it's a piece of legislation that essentially applies technology to the justice system so that people get access to something that they are already entitled to. So here in New York, if you have certain criminal convictions, most of them are misdemeanors falling into the lower end of the spectrum, and a specific period of time has passed and you haven't committed a further crime, you are entitled to have that record sealed. The impact of having that record sealed across the board, where we look at data studies, you are more likely to get an interview for a job by about 50%. You are more likely to get that job, again, by about 50%. And actually, in the states where this has happened, the job that you get is more likely to be better paid. So I feel like in this room, I don't need to explain why that's a good thing. And so what Clean Slate does is essentially it runs a software program through court records so that people who are already entitled to that record sealing process get that record sealing process applied automatically. And if you're sitting here thinking, this sounds shiny, this is a nice thing, do we absolutely need it? Here in New York, the percentage of people that are entitled to have their records sealed, but who are actually, it'd be fun to see what people guessed would be the percentage. But of the people who are entitled to have their records sealed, 1% are actually getting their records sealed. So when we're thinking about what are those practical things that we can do right now that businesses could be involved in, the time is right now for Clean Slate in New York. Here we are in New York, as you pointed out. God knows, I never know where I am. Living out of a small rollerboard suitcase is the answer to that. But here in New York, Clean Slate is on the table. The timing for that is April, as we look to get the governor to put it into this budget this year. And the impact would be that we just did this in Utah, much smaller state, much smaller population. But on the day that software program was switched on in Utah, upwards of 400,000 people had their records sealed on that day.
Wow. And it's wildly important in that, A, we've got a giant labor shortage.
Yeah.
And we certainly have a labor shortage for lower wage jobs. Right? We've had this great resignation where people say, I don't want to work for $15 an hour. Well, there are plenty of people that want to work. The percentage of people that are released from jail that get a job is tiny. And even when they get jobs, if they have a record, then they have a hard time getting a lease. They have a hard time, we hired a bunch of people directly, coming right from prison, and paid them good salaries, $100,000 plus salaries. And even with a $150,000 salary, zero chance of a guy getting a lease unless we have a friend give it to him. And so the obstacles put in place for people who are coming out of prison, coming out of jail, are immense. And so things like the Clean Slate Act, especially after they've served their time, and especially for things that don't put the community at any risk, seem to be like essential pieces of legislation to pass.
Can I dwell on that issue of safety for a second? Because I think, often in criminal justice reform, we're talking, it's hard to speak with specificity about the public safety impact of a particular bill, but actually on Clean Slate, because we have 5 or 6 states that have already done this, we're able to look at what the public safety impact is. And actually, when an individual who has a record has that record sealed, 5 years after the sealing process, that person is less likely to offend than somebody who has never committed a criminal offense. So if you are sitting in this room and you have a criminal record and it was expunged, it was sealed more than 5 years ago, I am statistically more likely to commit a criminal conviction than you are at this point.
Yeah. So Mike, I mean, considering the data that Celia just pointed out, you have just mentioned, you are someone who has been willing to hire someone with a criminal record. Are your colleagues, other executives in the industry, are they willing to as well? What are the conversations that you're having at this point in time?
Listen, I think, we originally hired people in Galaxy into our philanthropy, right? One of the things that's been both impressive, I guess, and sad is that people that spend lots of time in prison come out and feel a real need to fight the system. They don't want to leave their brothers and sisters behind in jail that have been subjected to really horrific conditions. And so they have this sense of purpose to fight the system. But it's also been one of the only places people can get good employment, working for Open Society Foundation or this network of criminal justice reform organizations. And so one thing we did this year is we hired a guy named Roddy Johnson. He's one of my favorite employees, 24 years on death row, falsely convicted. And we hired him into Galaxy. And we scaffolded him. We gave him lots of support. He just passed his paralegal exam. He was very proud, and I was proud of him, with flying colors. It won't shock me if he goes to law school soon. But it was interesting. I did that because I wanted to send a message to the other guys that you don't have to just work in criminal justice reform. Like, there's unbelievable talent. Rodney had done a lot of his own defense that got himself off death row for a crime he wasn't, falsely accused of. And so one of the things that I've learned, the 4 or 5 people that work in our philanthropy group that have served long periods of time are brilliant. Like, there's so much wasted talent that's left in jail for often crimes committed when they were 16 or 17 years old or 18 years old, mostly from growing up in the wrong neighborhood, right? And so, I tell the story often of Dwayne Betts. He's the poet laureate at Yale, just won a MacArthur Genius Award, spent 8 years or 9 years in jail, arrested when he was 16 years old or 15 years old for shoplifting. And he used to shoplift. He got caught shoplifting and then carjacking at the same mall I got caught shoplifting at, and Springfield Mall. And when I got caught shoplifting, they called my mother and they cut my fake ID in half and sent me home, and I got worried my dad was going to smack me. He got thrown in jail for 9 years. He was black and came from a worse neighborhood. Listen, he had a gun, I didn't. But he didn't shoot anybody. He didn't harm anybody. He scared somebody. And so this unequal opportunity and unequal punishment that has gone on in our country for long periods of time leaves a tremendous amount of human capital wasting away. And so both on the low end, right, at Bojangles, we initiated fair chance hiring about 3 years ago. We work with the state, we work with the company, and 2 really amazing things happened. People were nervous as hell. Like, the HR department was nervous. They didn't really want to do it. They were really worried that people in the stores wouldn't want to work with someone who'd spent time in jail. And when we told them we were going to hire people that had been formerly incarcerated, they all started weeping and crying. They were like, oh my God, this is our community. I've always wanted to hire those people. I didn't think we were allowed to. And, it's been a very successful program. It went from a pilot program at Bojangles to now it's just part of their normal HR process. The good news is that people stay longer. So if you're in the quick serve restaurant, the fast food business, employee turnover is one of your big costs. And so the employers are staying not a tremendous amount longer, but they're staying longer. So it's a net win for the company. But it's a net win for us as we change our thinking, right? There's 1 in 3 people in America has a family member that's been directly impacted by the criminal justice system. I think it's 1 in 3. So it's you might not have a cousin or a brother, but if you look at America broadly, it's a huge portion of our population. And so we need to shift how we think of this.
And Celia, you say that companies can get involved even, I mean, Mike was talking about a story from childhood. Companies can take a step and help youth even before they get incarcerated.
Yeah, thank you for asking me about this, because we actually launched last week a new initiative which is specifically focused on young people. So the work that Mike is referring to is often called second chance hiring in our space. It is very, very important, and it is about hiring people that have experienced the criminal justice system and mitigating the damage that they've experienced. But what we proposed was, what if you hire people that have never yet experienced the justice system, but based on research are very, very likely without intervention, without intentional steps, to end up in the justice system. Mike alluded to, a young person who'd been caught for shoplifting, people getting low-level records when they're in their teens. And really the perspective we came from was economic mobility. How much of a barrier to economic mobility is a criminal record? And the answer is profound. So if you really want to achieve diversity within workforces, if you really want to achieve wealth, no matter the color of your skin, then we absolutely must be factoring in the criminal justice system and incarceration as a component of that, and actually trying to take steps to not just mitigate the harm, prevent the harm from happening in the first place. And so based on a research study, we launched a program of intentionally holding a role, this is not an internship, but holding a role for young people falling into one of four categories. They'd aged out of foster care, they've experienced the juvenile justice system, they've experienced parental incarceration before the age of 18, or they've experienced sex or human trafficking. And what we're trying to do with them is create a relationship between community service providers and the employer to hire for potential for these young people and essentially give them a realistic, viable, very well supported alternative life track to ending up in the justice system and incarceration. And we launched this alongside Walmart last week, and they're our first business supporting us in doing this. And actually, when we talk about seeing the receipts for those pledges around George Floyd, this is an initiative that is being funded by Walmart.org through their philanthropy arm as part of their commitment to change the future for young people in the US.
Yeah, and it gets companies talking differently, right, about it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I think, I don't come from business. I always joke about this. I come from the criminal justice reform space. I've spent so much more time in jails than I have spent in boardrooms or in front of cameras. But I think what I've learned about businesses is it's not one size fits all, right? There's some companies that their CEO is going to be an incredible voice for things. There's some companies where the CEO has an allergic reaction if you ask to mic them up and put them on a stage. There's some companies that are going to look very much at the internal of what they're doing. There's some companies that are going to look very much at the external of what they're doing. And what we need to do as criminal justice reform campaigners, and those of us that are trying to disrupt the criminal justice system, is be nimble to that, right? And offer a menu of things and say, we understand that you're not going to order every single thing from this menu, but surely there is something on this list that you could do right now. And I do think that for those companies that are looking at young people in particular that are hiring for potential, we called the project Unlock Potential very, very intentionally in order to talk about hiring for potential. We feel like this could be a fit for some of those companies that perhaps haven't yet got as deep into criminal justice reform as a company like Galaxy and as a leader like Mike.
Mike, what would you advise companies to, if they're listening to this and they're starting to think about it, where do they start?
It's kind of the same answer I give with crypto. Get off zero. People are saying, well, I say, just start.
Get off zero.
And listen, proximity is so important, right? Before I started this journey myself, I would have been shocked to sit around a dinner table with four guys that spent over 20 years each in jail. You only spend 20 years in jail if you committed some violent crime that's pretty bad. You were part of a group that murdered someone or was in a gang fight, or and realized I'd have left my grandkids if I ever had grandkids with these guys, right? People change, they're not their worst moment. And so it's not until you have proximity to people that have gone through this horrific system and come out the other side, at times beautiful people, at times damaged, but trying to, work, that you start having empathy for their path. And so from young kids, getting out and wanting a second chance and be able to mentor people in that experience to people that have, I've got one friend who's 76 who spent 45 years in jail, and he's trying to get elders out of jail. It's the most insane thing that we keep anyone over 65 who's not a sociopath. And there's like this many sociopaths in the system, like literally less than a quarter of 1% in prison. The statistics say they don't commit crimes. They've changed. They want to be home. They're good mentors and role models, usually sitting on the stoop, even if they don't go back to work, warning kids about the problems. And so we have this system that's just so screwed up. And so what I tell CEOs, what I tell friends is, hire 1 or 2 people and see how they change your culture. Like proximity, this is Brian Stevenson's first message that I ever heard. It was like proximity, proximity, proximity. It's the truth.
And the workforce is needed. It's not just moral sense, it's economic sense.
There's a $57 billion deficit in the amount of money America is not generating in GDP from not putting people formerly incarcerated back to work.
Yeah.
$57 billion, it's not a small amount of money. It's a huge population. Remember, we put 10 million people a year through this system called jail and prison. 10 million people go in the doors, right? And any one night, there's 2.3 million people in there, 500,000 awaiting trial. It's this gigantic machine that just keeps processing out and creating carnage and trauma that everyone needs to start taking note of and figuring, how can I help a little?
Celia, I want to give you the final word.
I'm going to shamelessly ask people to join us in our new campaign on Unlock Potential. We're looking for companies to be part of our pilot program. We're actually asking companies to help us design this program. We want them to have skin in the game from the very start. So, I would absolutely echo what Mike said, which is get off zero, right? Like, if you are a company that's interested in using your government affairs power or your CEO's advocacy, there's a campaign for you. If you're looking at your workforce and wondering how you can be more supportive in your communities, there is a campaign for you. There is a program for you. So I think, Portion of Value, which is a communications agency, recently coined the term JEDI, essentially reflecting that equity, diversity, and inclusion needs to come after justice. If we're not addressing the justice system as part of a nuanced approach to diversity, equity, and inclusion, we're actually kind of missing something. And exactly as Mike said about the scale of it, America leads the world on incarceration. America is conducting essentially a social experiment into how many people in our society on any given day that we can keep in prisons and jails. And I think it's time for businesses to kind of it's not enough for us to stand on the sideline tutting and shaking our heads. Like, there's actually sort of measurable concrete steps that any company could take at any size and scale right now that would begin to dismantle that.
Equity, inclusion, and justice.
Justice, equity, diversity,
Jedi.
Jedi. It sounds better. The acronym is better.
It does. Than what I was just trying to do.
No, we got there.
Celia, Mike, thank you so much. That was a really fascinating conversation. We could talk forever. Thank you, everyone.
Please welcome to the stage Visa Chairman and CEO Alfred F. Kelly Jr. and Bloomberg's Jenny Sue Rain.
Hi, Al.
Jenny, good to be with you.
Thank you. And thank you guys for joining us. I'm super pleased to be joined by Al Kelly, the CEO of Visa. I think we all know Visa. Their logo is on 3.8 billion cards worldwide. They handle...
Or in this day and age, credentials.
Credentials, sorry.
Actually could be in your phone as well.
In the world of mobile payments, of course. And you guys handled, I think it was 2.8 trillion in payments volume last year, and just a very well-known company. So we're really excited to have you here and appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you. Great to be with you.
Another stat that I really like, so you guys have 21,500 employees in about 80 countries. And I know earlier this month you were one of the first CEOs to really offer a frank assessment of just the lengths that you had to go to get folks out of Ukraine and get them to safety. I think you described hiring mercenaries who would go into Ukraine and take folks out, putting Sprinter vans full of supplies at border crossings so that employees could take advantage of that. So I just wanted to check in first, maybe there, and just hear more from you in terms of how that process is going, and also the work you've done with folks in Russia as you wind down operations there.
Well, the prior weekend, I left on Saturday morning, and I went to Budapest and Warsaw and visited with our refugee employees in Ukraine. Unfortunately, many of them families that are split up because men between 18 and 60 can't leave the country. And we have employees in both Ukraine and Russia, so this impacted us in both countries. And from the beginning, our number one goal was to get as many people to safety who wanted to be. The reality is today we have about 60 families, so we took care of children, in some cases mothers and fathers, where we did send vans through a couple of different security companies. Almost all our global security people are either in Hungary or Poland right now. And we extracted people when we could. It's getting harder and harder to do. We have about a dozen people left in Kiev. It's going to be hard to get them out at this point. Most of our employees are scattered along the western coast, hoping to stay, hoping not to have to break up their families. When I was in Poland, that's when the base 12 kilometers from the Polish border was bombed, and one of our employees' husband is in the army, and she had been FaceTiming him with him every day, and she went like half a day or 3/4 of a day without hearing from him. And right before I left Poland to head to Dubai to see our Russian employees, she grabbed me and told me that she had gotten a text from him that he was alive, which at least is good news. But it shows the impact this is having. And we're equally committed to our Russian employees. We ended up 2 weeks ago shutting down or suspending our business in Russia. Not an easy decision, but a decision that was driven by three things. One is with the sanctions, it was getting increasingly difficult to operate. Number two, the reality was that we were concerned about this unprovoked war that had been thrust upon the people in Ukraine. And number three, we thought that for the sake of everybody, that an orderly wind down of the business where we weren't forced into it by another round of sanctions that might say, immediately you have to shut down, was in the best interests of everybody. And we subsequently made available to our Russian employees the ability to relocate, and if they relocated, we would give them a job. And in what is quite a statement, we had a town hall with them on a Sunday morning, and by that Wednesday, 70 of them and their families had already moved to Dubai. Today, I believe that, now I didn't get a briefing this morning, but last I knew we were somewhere in the neighborhood of about 120 employees and their families had migrated to Russia. So we'll see what happens. A lot of these folks are hopeful that they'll get back in weeks. I'm not sure that's going to be the case. I think this is going to be a prolonged battle. I think Putin underestimated the will and the skill of the Ukrainian people. And I think it looks like his own military has not been as strong as he might have thought. So I think this is going to go on for quite some time, unfortunately. But we're going to be there for our employees. This is not something we're into it for 2 or 3 weeks. We're into it for the long term, and whatever it takes to make sure that they and their families are taken care of, we'll do everything we can.
And we're at the Equality Summit, where I think we've heard a lot of companies talk about values. And I know when you made the Russia announcement, you talked about that being partially driven by the values you guys hold as a company. I guess it would be great to maybe take me to that decision and just walk me through, having the conviction and those values that you talked about and making that call.
Well, I think, in the first few days, it obviously was upsetting, but as you started to see the ramifications of war, I mean, we haven't seen it nearly this up close before, and the level of coverage, because there's so many media outlets, it's in all of our living rooms and family rooms. I told the story of having been in church a couple of Sundays ago when I normally don't take my phone, but I did because of everything going on, and got a text that President Zelensky was trying to get a hold of me. So I have to say, President Zelensky, I probably heard from everybody in his cabinet. I mean, They did a very good job of trying to make their case. But obviously our Ukrainian employees were highly upset, and we have numbers of Ukrainian employees around the world. And by the way, non-Ukrainian employees. I was in Washington the last day and a half, and one of the things that was a real theme down there is that the one thing Putin might have underestimated in this whole thing, in addition to the Ukrainian will and skill of their military, is how uniting this event has been. It's really brought not just the NATO countries together, but the world together, kind of rooting for the underdog and trying to see what they could do for Ukraine. So I think when it all came down to having the facts in front of us and the idea that we wanted to do this in an orderly fashion, that it just simply fell into the category, Jenny, of being the right thing to do.
Got it. I'm curious, I do think we hear increasingly from CEOs employee feedback and like that employee dialogue almost, that drives a lot of these conversations and topics and ultimately decisions. Is that in your experience as well?
It definitely is. Look, the email years ago started to bring down barriers of the assistant who blocked access for you and provided some level of protection for you as a leader. And I think in what is a good sign of our culture, I'm very flexible. I end up most town halls telling people, if you didn't get a chance to ask your question, my email is al.kelly@visa.com. And I do that all the time. And I hear from employees every day on a whole bunch of issues. And this certainly was no exception. I think employees are, I think in good, open companies that are transparent, employees feel comfortable sharing what's on their mind. Doesn't mean I always agree. Sometimes people ask for things that are idealistic. Sometimes I get incredible input of something I hadn't thought about. So, net, I think it's all a very positive thing. And I certainly try to encourage and have as much dialogue down through the organization. Being a CEO can be a very lonely job. And if you lock yourself up, you can find it becoming not just lonely, but isolating. And I never want that to be the case with me. So I try to make sure that I reach out and talk to people, and being able to go and I brought over, when I went over to Hungary and Poland, brought tons of clothes and toys for kids, et cetera, and to be able to hug it out with people who have been through very, very trying and difficult decisions, it makes you feel good. It was emotional, but fulfilling, and it made sense. I actually brought my 18-year-old daughter, who had come with me on a previous trip 3 years ago to Kyiv, and found it to be a beautiful city, which it is. It's a terrific city. And she was on spring break, and she actually asked me, she felt badly about the whole thing, and actually asked me if she could come. And she was a big help, kind of giving out clothing and toys. And I think it was great for me to have her with me, and I think it was a great experience for her as well.
I know another area where CEOs seem to get a lot of feedback is the whole return to the office.
Oh my gosh.
And I think you guys are planning to begin bringing more folks back in the coming weeks. And so I wanted to get your take on this very hot topic right now, and kind of how you're thinking about it, and how you're trying to cajole folks back and get them back into the house.
Yeah, it's not easy. Look, we've learned a couple of things, right, that are undeniable. Most people can do their job from home. Certainly in white-collar jobs, and maybe non-services types of jobs. We've also learned and have to recognize that people like the flexibility. They find that gives them more time with family. It's better for the planet if they're not commuting and burning fossil fuels getting to work. And 53% of our company is millennials, and that kind of, that's particularly important to them. So those, we all have to stand up to, I think all of us as CEOs have to stand up and recognize those realities. However, I do have some concerns about it. I should start by saying what we're going to do is we've told people we'd like to be in the office 50% of the time. And we want everybody in the office on Tuesdays and Wednesdays, so that we have clear collaboration days where we don't have to make a bunch of coordinating phone calls saying, Jenny, are you going to be in on Wednesday? No, I'm only in on Tuesday. And Mary, are you in on Tuesday? No, I'm only in on Thursday. I just thought it was kind of wasteful. So we're saying everybody's got to be in work 50% of the time in the office, 50% at home, or more in the office, obviously, if you want. And you got to do Tuesdays and Wednesdays. The concerns I have fall into a couple of categories. One is that you need some form of togetherness to build culture. Companies shouldn't be static entities. They need to have some vibrancy to them. They need to have some esprit de corps. They need to have some common view of values. That's what creates a stickiness, that I want to be there. And speaking of that stickiness, the second thing is I want people to be focused on career as much as job. So yes, you can do your job at home, but is it the right thing for your career? So that's very much on my mind. Thirdly, I do think you have to spend some time in the office, especially in a business like ours, where we don't make anything. It's all intellectual horsepower, and we're trying to build capabilities and solutions and design technology for our clients around the world. And getting in and doing a session with a whiteboard, et cetera, it's hard to do that in a situation where you're doing it via some kind of video mechanism. The last thing I'm very concerned about is D&I going backward. I really am worried about it. Minorities will because they're the minorities, tend to be a bit shyer, tend to be less in the mainstream. And that's easier for them and the majority to break through when you're in person, right? Like I could see a minority and go over to their desk and say, how you doing? Even whether it's coming back or going to the men's room, which is something I would commonly do. I commonly walk the halls. So you can't walk the halls on Zoom. It's just not doable. And I think inclusion in particular requires getting people together and grabbing people and say, hey, join me on this meeting or join me on this phone call. And again, hard to do in a video world. And I don't want it to go back. It would be bad if this turns back to a situation where we move backward with women and we move backward with minorities. It would be a horrible outcome. And one of the things I keep saying to everybody is we're not going to know for 10 years whether we made the right decisions or not. I look at our company. When I started as CEO almost 6 years ago, we had 14,000 employees. Now we have 22,000. 5 years from now, we'll have 30,000. That means I need a lot more leaders. And leaders need to get developed. And I believe completely, 100%, that I would never be the CEO of Visa if I worked from home all the time. Because I was gutty, I was gritty, I got my hands dirty, I built relationships, I listened, I went to every single meeting I could, I grabbed people in the hall and asked them questions. I was very curious, and all of that curiosity and relationship building, I think, had a lot to do with me getting ahead, and good fortune in working with good people. So I think that we're all going to have to be very careful. I've told our organization we're learning as we go, and this next year is a learning cycle. By the way, we've also introduced that for 4 weeks during the year, you can work anywhere you want. But you have to do it in buckets of weeks, not days. So you can either do a month somewhere, 2 weeks somewhere, or 4 1 weeks, and you can go to Florida or Utah or Arizona or someplace else, and that's perfectly fine. So we're also giving that flexibility. So we're going to have to see. I'm going to watch it really carefully. If I think that it's going to have negative, I see it trending toward having negative long-term implications, we're going to have to talk about that.
And so what does the office look like I guess, especially given your point about not going to the office and sitting on Zooms all day? What does the office look like in this new learning period for Visa? Well,
I think it's never been harder to be a leader than it is now. Never. In my career, and I started working out of graduate school in 1981, I've said to our leaders that you're going to have to be so much more planful. You're almost going to have to be a grammar school teacher thinking about how you keep that curriculum. I mean, there's nothing. I have a daughter who's a kindergarten teacher, and she has to be super organized to keep 25-year-olds busy for 5 hours. And I've watched her, she plans out every 10 minutes of what the day is going to be like. We don't have to quite go that far, but we have to be planful, because the objective has to be that the days people are in the office, when they are going home at night on the train, the subway, the bus, or driving, they're saying, boy, was I glad I was in the office today. And if they go home saying, that sucked, I could have done everything I did at home, and I had to come into the office, I had to burn commuting time in both directions, people's not going to like that either. So we have to be so much more planful about how we build collaboration time. I think you and I may have talked about meals. I think meals and drinks are an incredibly powerful weapon, because you can't do that via Zoom. So, have some employees and bring in bagels, or get pizza at lunch, or go for a drink after work. That by itself will justify being present together. So we just have to be much more planful. It's a lot more pressure on leaders than they've ever had. It's not as easy to call that spontaneous meeting. You really got to think about, okay, what do I want to get done next week? And if I'm going to have everybody on Tuesdays and Wednesdays, how do I organize those 2 days to be great days in terms of collaboration and togetherness, et cetera?
I agree. Never underestimate the value of free pizza.
Never.
Very powerful.
Free food, man, it works all the time.
That's awesome. Well, and I know, I loved your point about diversity and inclusion and kind of staying focused on that. I think last month you guys announced a really interesting program where you guys are going to put $100 million in deposits with minority depository institutions. And we've seen a lot of different work with MDIs over the last few years. I think a lot of others maybe have done like equity investments, but you guys went the deposits route. And I would love to hear a little bit more about that program, but also why go that direction and really put your kind of money where your mouth is? Well,
we've made a very conscious decision to take our D&I efforts on the road, if you will, to the external world. We announced after the terrible George Floyd incidents, a Visa Black Scholars and Jobs program where we committed $10 million. We actually have 50 freshmen in college right now, black students who are, I think they're at 38 different schools. And we'll give them scholarship money for 4 years. And if they do their job in school, they'll have an internship between junior and senior year, and then a guaranteed job when they leave. We've stood up an inclusive partnerships group where we literally, just like any other kind of partner team, we're out talking to minority organizations. At the moment, we started our focus with Native Americans and black business owners. And then we decided, using our treasury capability and our cash, that we would start this Minority Depository Accelerate program, where we have made a commitment to put $100 million to work of our cash as deposits. And what does that do? Number one, it helps a bank build their balance sheet, which is important. And secondly, it's a catalyst for trying to drive lending and inclusive growth. We did, before we started this program, we made a $10 million deposit into One United in California, a minority-owned bank, and they leveraged that to help support a $150 million affordable housing project that they wouldn't have otherwise been able to do. So we think we can help. A lot of these organizations are really focused on helping that local community that's not quite in the mainstream. And there are 1.7 billion people on the face of the earth today who are not in the financial mainstream. And some of them are within, a mile of here. We kind of tend to think about emerging markets in Southeast Asia, but some of them are right here in Manhattan and other big cities. And it's these minority institutions that are trying to really reach these people. And we have, we're a company that generates a lot of free cash, and this is a great way to try to help them by making deposits into their institutions.
Gotcha. Well, it was lovely to hear from you. Thank you so much. This was great. And yeah.
Jenny, great to see you. Thank you.
Lisa. Thank you.
Welcome to the stage, political commentator and 60th mayor of Atlanta, Keisha Lance Bottoms, and Bloomberg's Jacqueline Simmons.
Thank you for being here, Mayor Bottoms. I know a lot of people stayed in the room because they really wanted to hear from you. So, Mayor Bottoms, the world watched you lead the city of Atlanta through COVID, through social unrest and protest, some heart-wrenching violence and economic turmoil. And you officially stepped down as the 60th mayor of Atlanta in January. Post-term, how are you focusing your time?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me, and thank you to the entire Bloomberg family. Bloomberg Philanthropies, Associates, Mike Bloomberg, great partners with the city of Atlanta. So I am figuring it out. I was at my desk in my home one day until about 9:30 at night, and I was telling my mother how tired I was. She said, well, what are you doing? I said, that's a good question. So I've had a couple of resets. They're only 24 hours in a day. And just getting back to normal. I'm speaking, I am doing commentating and all sorts of things, including taking my kids to basketball practice and carpool every day.
Got it. And you were on a short but very esteemed list to become vice president in 2020. Does the White House remain a goal for you?
Each time I have the honor of going to the White House, I feel like I'm going into Disney World. When you are in politics, it of course doesn't get any better than that. And it is such a magical place. And so I've been there a couple of times over the past month. I was just there last week, and I still have to pinch myself. So never say never. Right now I'm working on carpool, and we'll see what the future holds.
That sounds like a goal. I'm just going to call it, but.
Okay.
Beyond the White House, and just one more question about aspirations, because I spent some time, checking you out over the weekend just to look at the clips and everything. I never heard you say or rule return to political life out. Under which context would you return to the political scene?
I never thought I would run for mayor of Atlanta. It took a very long time for me to get comfortable with the idea of running for mayor. But just as certain as I was that I should run for mayor, I was just as certain that it was time to exit and put a period at the end of that season. And during my press conference, when I announced that I was not running, I said voters get to decide every 4 years, and so do I. And it is time to pass the baton on to someone else. So that's a very long way of saying, I don't know, but I will know when I know.
Got it. Okay, so let's pivot a little bit into elections, nationwide and in your state of Georgia. There's a lot of elections coming up. You've got 4 key posts in the state of Georgia: Secretary of State, House, Senate, Governor. We're going to talk about governor in a second, but I know you've said that you hope voters turn out. How concerned are you that people won't turn out, especially after the big voting rights legislative loss in January?
I'm very concerned, and for many reasons. And I say my best polling source goes between my mother and my college student, my oldest son. And when I look at my son, I look at someone who's not very satisfied, not mature enough to understand that there is a process and that it doesn't happen with just one election. He very much wants instant results. And I think that's reflective of a lot of people in America right now. But just as I'm constantly drilling into him, every single election counts. You just can't go and vote for president and then not come back. You've got to vote in local elections, state elections, federal elections. But it concerns me. And then on top of that, we have had massive voter suppression laws put into place in Georgia. Drop boxes have been restricted. The length of time that people can go and vote, early voting has been limited, and you can't even pass out water in line in June in Georgia. So I know that there's a lot of frustration, and then on top of that, we're still recovering as a country. So you have people going, well, what was that all about? Because I don't feel like my life is any better. I don't necessarily agree with that, but I know that's the sentiment. And so we've got to keep reminding people that it matters. And I posted something on Instagram yesterday saying, if you don't think elections matter, take a look at the confirmation hearings. This is what happens when you have the opportunity to show up and vote. Historic things can happen, but again, it's a process.
So what do you tell, not just is he 18-year-old, your son?
19.
19-year-old?
Almost 20.
Okay, your almost 20-year-old son and other voters in his age bracket. What do you tell them when they're on the fence or they're frustrated because it's not moving fast enough?
Well, my son, it's, you better go vote. And I'm going at 3 o'clock and you better meet me there. That's what I tell him. But my more polite way is that, and I think of the words of Audre Lorde, revolution is not a one-time event. And especially in Atlanta, where we have such a deep and abiding connection to the civil rights movement led by young people, reminding them that there were students from the Atlanta University Center that literally changed the world, and that the power is still within their hands. And if they don't like what's happening, then go vote and change it.
But how does just widening the lens a little bit, how does the DNC and the Biden administration come back from a legislative collapse that happened in January in a way that fires up the base? In a way that fires up the base in a way that the other Republicans have fired up the base?
Well, you know, when you take polls, it's a snapshot in time. So polls can swing from this way, they can swing that way. And I'm a living testament to that. When I ran for mayor, just a week before the election, I was 6 points down in the polls, and I ended up winning by a very slim margin. And I say that to say, I know a lot of people are looking at polls and looking at where President Biden may be in the polls and believe that that's going to be reflective in the midterms, but I don't receive that. And what I know is that the DNC is continuing to do the work, continuing to invest money in communities towards countering the voter suppression efforts, towards registering voters, towards the messaging efforts. And in the midst of the horrible tragedy that's happening in Ukraine, I believe voters are taking a fresh look at our president and what he has to offer as a leader. And I believe that people will be satisfied with that come the midterms if we stay the course and remind people of things that have been done. So it's incumbent upon us to approach messaging, not in necessarily the traditional ways. I talk about my mother. My mother needs to get a phone call. She needs to get a mailer. She's going to watch television. She's going to see the commercials. My 19-year-old, not so much. If it's not on his phone, on the screen, he's not going to see it. So we've got to make sure that the messaging on the American Rescue Funds and all these things that have been done for working families and for students, that messaging is drilled into voters as they go back in the midterms.
Okay, we're going to key up a voter poll, just a Twitter poll from the audience in just 1 second, but I have to ask one question. I was going to park it, but I'm going to ask you quickly about the business community, because I thought I heard when you were mayor, you were meeting with CEOs every quarter as sort of consulting with them. And I wonder, I'm watching what's happening in Disney with the LGBTQ bill, and I'm wondering, as part of your initiative to get voter turnout and, you know, voter rights generally, what kind of conversations are you having with the business community? Is there a way that they feel that they can afford to either stay on the fence or lean into the issue? What does that look like if it is happening at all?
Well, thankfully, in Atlanta, we have been very proactive in engaging with our business community. So I would meet with our Fortune 500 CEOs. We have about 30 Fortune 500 companies in Atlanta once a quarter, and university presidents and presidents of our major healthcare systems in the city. And it's a very cohesive group. So those conversations are actively happening. And input is asked, what do you think about this? And also their suggestions. And it's a very healthy dialogue. And it's been great for our communities because we're talking about equity. They stood up vocational training in our city. They've helped fund a number of initiatives that have helped us move the needle in terms of equity. But what I would say is look at Georgia, again, as to what it can do to your bottom line if you aren't thoughtful about your policies. When many of these voter suppression bills were passed, the All-Star game was removed from Georgia. And I took that as a warning shot, that if we continue down this path, and we remember what happened in North Carolina with some of the efforts related to equality, that this can be the case in Georgia, and I would expect that it could possibly be the case if Disney is not thoughtful about the position that it takes. And I think that really is a lesson for CEOs across the country, that if you want people to be consumers of your product and visit your locations, then you have to be thoughtful about policies that you may be silent about. Again, Audre Lorde, whom I love, your silence will not protect you.
You know, these companies, just real quick, are these companies willing to put their face to the idea that they're supporting these measures? Or is the feedback you're getting they want to stay behind the scenes?
Well, I don't think most business leaders want to get into politics. It can be very complicated. And again, I go back to Georgia. Delta Airlines had a gas tax in Georgia. And when there were some disagreements with the governor and the leadership on some issues, they tried to pull back on the gas tax. So it can be a very difficult conversation, but sometimes you can't avoid the conversation. There are times when personally and professionally and as leaders, you have to speak up when it's not the most opportune moment, but it's necessary.
Okay, let's go to the polling question, if we can pull that up. The question being...
And as you pull that up, I'll just give an example. When Martin Luther King Jr. was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in Atlanta, or the Nobel Peace Prize, there was a conversation in Atlanta about whether or not he would be received at home. And it was Robert Woodruff, the Coca-Cola family, who said, we will receive him, and we will do it in an integrated manner at an integrated dinner. And, you know, that was his moment in time where the world had awarded Martin Luther King Jr. for his efforts, but even at home, we were still dealing with segregation in the city, and it was a renowned business leader who stood up and made a difference in our city.
Okay, so we have, I don't know if that's coming up, I guess it's coming up here. So the question is, the polling question is, which issue needs more attention when it comes to voting rights reform? And the answer that got the most, 68.6% said ending gerrymandering. That was the #1 issue that needed the most attention, followed by voting accessibility, followed by advocacy at 6.4%. Voting accessibility is 25%. Is that the way you would have ranked?
I would agree with that. And Ambassador Young shares his story quite a bit about when he ran for Congress and rained all day. There was one day of voting, and there was a 70% turnout. And 90-year-old Ambassador Young cautions us not to let the efforts to limit our access to voting stop us from voting. What he says, and I'm paraphrasing, is no matter what they do, if you have the ability to show up, it's still your obligation to show up and vote.
I want to talk about the black vote specifically, but before I want to talk about a video where you said that you would do everything in your power to make sure that Stacey Abrams is elected the next governor of Georgia. So I wanted to ask you specifically about how you're working with Ms. Abrams and what you're doing to support her candidacy.
Well, one, we need Stacey Abrams as governor of Georgia. That's a period. And I am awaiting my marching orders. You know, campaigns are very complex. You don't want to get ahead, and you certainly don't want to mess it up. So I am awaiting my marching orders, but really there's been a Republican fight in Georgia. The governor is being primaried by Senator Perdue. So they've been battling it out, and now you're starting to see Stacey Abrams' campaign become more active. So I am sure I will have some marching orders very soon. But right now, I am just reminding people to register to vote and to show up to vote. And as we get closer to the primary, I'm sure there'll be a whole lot more for me to say.
Okay. Yeah, which takes us right back to the first question about next steps, but we will be watching that. The black vote. So I want to ask about that. You know, President Biden got 87% of the black vote back in 2020. We've seen an erosion in his approval rating with the black demographic. I think it was down to 60% in one of the recent major polls. That was down from 73%. And same in terms of the black approval rating for congressional Democrats. It's also at 60% down somewhat. So my question is, how do you make sure you are doing everything to keep the black voter motivated?
Again, it goes back to messaging and making sure that people understand what's being done on their behalf. We were in a room with Congresswoman Nakima Williams and some other folk from the DNC and a group of college students from Spelman, Morehouse, Clark, Atlanta University, Georgia State, you name it. We got a lot of schools in and around Atlanta. And one young man was lamenting that nothing's been done. And someone asked the question, did you get a check recently? And he said, yeah. And they said, well, where do you think the check came from? And he said, I don't know. I don't know. and as we talked, he thought that it had come from his school. And the person said, no, that came through the Biden administration. So my point being, there are things that are being done that are making the lives of people better. But if we aren't messaging that, and if people don't understand what those things are, and it's not just about handing out a check, it's about policies, and there's work being done, and we now have this amazing, accomplished woman sitting before the Senate having confirmation hearings to be appointed to the Supreme Court. We have to message that and remind people of that, especially in the black community, because we were an important part of the last election cycle as a voting bloc.
And by we, who are we, just to be clear?
Everybody. I mean everybody, from the DNC to our state officials, to our local officials. We have to speak what's happening that's benefiting our communities. And we've got to do it in a way that people will receive that information. I remember during the campaign, my 11-year-old son's a big NBA fan, so he's always watching something NBA related on YouTube. He's 11. And I walked by and I kept seeing Donald Trump commercials coming in. And what it said to me, and I knew this, but it confirmed it for me, that there was this alternative messaging geared toward making sure that whether it's my 11-year-old, 14-year-old, 19-year-old watching YouTube, that they would be unhappy with what was happening. So it wasn't about people, it was about suppressing the vote, getting people to stay at home. And I suspect that's going to happen again. And I think in the same way that we've seen right-wing groups perfect this alternative messaging, I think that we have to be very thoughtful about how we message. My 19-year-old's not going to watch the press conference on CNN, but he will get it if he's watching YouTube or if it comes through on Snapchat or any number of other things that I don't know how to watch and work.
I've got 100 more questions, but unfortunately we don't have that much time. But I do want to hit this question of housing affordability in Atlanta because it's a hot market right now. It's a hot market, especially for investors who've been snapping up properties and houses. I think in the last quarter, a third of all houses sold went to investors, driving up prices by 22%, on top of the fact that you've got inflation, which is one of the highest in the country. So my question, you had a very ambitious plan to address this issue of housing affordability when you were mayor. How do you even begin to crack that issue when you see that kind of data?
We had a plan for $1 billion invested and to create and/or preserve 20,000 housing units by the year 2026. We were, I believe, close to $700 billion in investment at the end of my $700 million at the end of my first term, or close to it at least. And we were close to, I believe, 9,000 units created and/or preserved. So the Bloomberg family, Bloomberg team was incredible in helping us craft a plan, creating the metrics, one, so that we could measure it, that we could get everybody in the same room to have the discussion on how we create and preserve affordable housing. And it gives us an opportunity to expand that discussion. So while we were having it internally and with our public stakeholders, now we can have these conversations with an even broader group, roll out this plan to others and say, this is what we're trying to do. And if it's not happening in your city, this is how you do it. This is how you measure it. Because a lot of people care about housing affordability, not just people who can't afford to live in our city. When I would talk with CEOs about it, they cared about it because the people worked in their office or their assistant was driving an hour and a half to work. They cared because their second grader's teacher didn't live in the city. The Republican lawmakers cared because they had to come into the city for 3 months during the legislative session to live in the city. So there were a lot of interested partners that you otherwise wouldn't think would be interested that were willing to help us work on that issue. And I know that can happen. If it happened in Atlanta, it can happen everywhere.
So it's sort of a advice-angled piece before we wrap, but for the future female mayors listening or watching you right now, what would you tell her about what it takes to lead a major U.S. metropolis, knowing what you now know post-COVID and post-George Floyd?
There is more in you than you can ever begin to imagine. And it's often when you are in the fire that your ability to lead comes out most. We lead as women, we just often don't call it leadership. We think it's something else. We think it's just what we do. But there is an ability for so many women to do it, the highest seat of government, to do it locally, to do it at any level. And if we don't take our seat at the table and articulate our issues and those cares and concerns that impact us every day and impact our families and communities, if we don't hold that seat down, nobody's going to speak for us. So what I would say to women across the country is go for it and don't be afraid.
Mayor Bottoms, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Please welcome to the stage Macy's Inc. Chairman and CEO Jeff Gennette and Bloomberg's Jordan Holman.
Hello, everyone. I know we are standing between you guys and happy hour, so here we go. Jeff, thank you so much for joining us.
It's good to be here, Jordan.
We just heard from my city's old mayor, and so it's nice to transition now back to New York City where we are. So I've been covering Macy's for a long time, and I know you guys just this month unveiled your new social purpose platform that you're calling Mission Everyone. And it has other initiatives that you guys have already had, some leadership diversity initiatives, the 15% pledge. So can you explain what's the new element of the platform?
So Mission Everyone for us was the opportunity to focus our social purpose in a way that the company has a strategy that gets behind it, where we put metrics behind it, where we put accountability behind it. And so I think we've always been pretty good on a number of these subjects, but we really didn't have a galvanizing filter that helped us decide what was important and what we wanted to put energy on. So what really has been new on it is really what we've been able to do. When you think about it, we've pledged about $5 billion that we're going to put to sustainable, and diverse products. So that's one of the first things that we did, and we're going to do that by the year 2024, and we can go into some of the detail of that. And then when you look at Mission Everyone, it's got like 3 pillars to it. The first one is really about people and what we do with our colleagues and what we do with our partners. The second is on communities, and particularly what we do with our communities in where our stores are, but really on a national level, what we do with our grants, what we do with local volunteerism, what we do with new communities and diverse youth that are looking for a foothold in retail. And then the third, which is a newness for us, is really what we're doing with Planet and what we're doing with our sustainability goals and how we're articulating that because of our colleagues are really pushing us to do that, because our customers are expecting it of us, certainly our shareholder is, and so we can go into any details on that.
Got it. And so since some of these things that you guys have looked at, obviously racial diversity, sustainability, that has been on Macy's mind, what type of progress do you think you guys can now make now that it's under this umbrella that you couldn't previously when they were different initiatives?
Yeah. So what I'd say, let's start with when we talk about kind of Mission Everyone and we look at the people section. So I'll talk about the 2 different camps. One of them is on diverse representation. So we've always had a very good culture. And we've always had, a culture where we've been able to retain some of the best talent, but we had a drop off, particularly with our diverse executives in kind of the middle management rank. And the opportunity to get more symmetry between what's on the front line and the communities that we serve all the way to the boardroom, we had that middle section where we had high dropout. And so taking Mission Everyone and saying, okay, what are our goals and strategies to really make sure that we're bringing equity to those particular executives, we're giving them the support that they need, and we're making sure that they're all part of diverse slates. And when we think about how we're going to be doing our promotions and the interview process and all of that, making sure that they have the tools that they need. So we've done that through a lot of various programs that was part of Mission Everyone. When we look at the 15% pledge, that's on the partner side. So that was the opportunity to say, we kind of started at this early. And 10 years ago, when we looked at these amazing communities that we're serving, but we didn't have a lot of Black and owned businesses or even women-owned businesses. And so when you started to look at that, we saw an opportunity to what could we do to train them. And so we created a program called The Workshop, which is a business development program. And we have gone through 10 years of this. Mm-hmm. We've graduated 175 companies, and it just keeps getting better. It's getting more and more relevant. But what we kept finding was that when you're dealing with a company like Macy's or Bloomingdale's, you're talking about companies that have a lot of scale. And this idea that you would be you're a Black-owned designer, you've got products, but how do you operate at scale for something that would be for hundreds of stores or go to a website? So we needed to find new ways to be able to give them opportunities. So part of Mission Everyone is to expand on that. And what you see in kind of the new iteration of the workshop is bringing them mentorship, bringing them funding for granting, giving them through the internet opportunities to be able to have their assortment online for a month period, see if it gets traction. Then we make decisions about putting it in other stores. Offering our graduates exposure to a lot of other brands and a lot of other retailers that might have use for them. So what we do is we might graduate somebody that is not at Macy's, but their business is flourishing because they've got new contacts that we've helped them with. So the 15% pledge has been an interesting one. Because when we took that on, it was this idea that you would have 15% of your net receipts would be with Black-owned businesses. And for us, we started with a very small percentage. And just by calling that out and saying to our colleague population, this matters, this is of consequence. What's the reason we do it? And how do we do it? And since we've done that, we've now, it's 5 times the amount of Black-owned brands that we have. I showed you in the waiting room what we're doing with Icons of Style. It was our opportunity to work with Black designers, and instead of having them produce their goods, we produce it for them. We use our private brands as a platform to scale them into hundreds of stores and into our website. And, that plus doing scholarships and doing mentorships and just, we're on our way. We're never going to be done with this. I think we're still in the early innings of making this work, but it matters to our customers. It certainly matters to our colleagues. And I think ultimately it matters to our shareholder.
You've mentioned the 15% pledge a few times, and here at Bloomberg, we closely follow that.
Yeah.
Wrote about Macy's when they signed on in late 2020. And I wanted to also hear a little bit more about that progress. I know you touched on some of the things. So I know Sephora recently came out. They were the first ones to sign the 15% pledge. They said now with those investments, that intentionality, they're at 8%. Where is Macy's currently at when it comes to reaching?
We're still less than 5% when you think about the scale of the businesses that we do. But we are, again, we'll probably have a 5 times growth this year. And the ambition is to continue to grow from that. What you need to do is you need to find a brand that you can scale into a lot of doors. In a lot of cases, what you have is that you might have a brand that starts out with a Black designer and then they sell it to a company that has the opportunity to scale it, or they do scale it differently. So one of the things that we look at is we look at diverse spend in all of its totality. It's not just the owned business, but it also is second tier. We particularly see that as you think about non-retail. So when you think about construction and housekeeping and all the other elements, finance, when you look at legal, there's lots of opportunities for us to work. The firm might be white owned, but there's a lot of subcontract work that they do that could be a Black-owned business. And we really put that into our contracts to try and get those second tiers built up. And we do that across our entire procurement schedule. And all of our teams are basically incented against that. We make that, again, it's a high company enterprise priority, and we measure it. And we're very, very clear on how we execute to that.
So what people should understand about Macy's when you guys are thinking about scaling or to include more Black-owned businesses, it's not just in the merchandise that's being sold.
It's not just in the merchandise. When you look at it, it's about 2/3 of the spend is in non-retail.
Okay. The whole supply chain you guys are looking at.
So you think about trucking. You go through all the elements of how we bring our goods and services to market. It takes a lot of non-retail supply chain.
Got it. And I wanted to talk more about the workshop at Macy's. So like you said, you guys are very much ahead of this. I believe it launched in 2011, so it's over a decade old. And what it is, it's a retail training and development program.
Right.
To making sure that diverse founders, whether it's racially diverse women, LGBTQ, veteran-owned, they're getting the right resources to be able to do business with Macy's or in retail in general. So since the summer of 2020, what investments do you guys realize you needed to make into the business to help drive even more progress for those businesses?
Yeah, the first thing is that we had to pull in the entire, it wasn't just going to be a marketing or a merchandising decision. It's how do we give them support in finance? How do we make sure that we give them kind of, what is the path to kind of a bulletproof P&L that is going to make them successful at retail? Putting the entire apparatus behind the success of those individuals and making sure that that was all part of the curriculum. We started out, as you know, we did with Babson College. One of the things that we found is that how do these brands, particularly with social media and the emergence of that about how they market their authentic stories and their wares, of how you use, Meta or how you use Google, bringing our relationships there into the room so they can get tutorials and mentorship on that was a big piece. Having online certification, online courses. So the pandemic really pushed us into being able to reach so many more, talented, companies out there that we
before was it in person?
It was in person.
So the pandemic.
We would do it over like a 2-week window. It's now a longer curriculum. This online training has been big. And then there's just things that have been always issues. We do lots of surveying to understand, okay, what are your pain points? What do we need to help you work through? We also do check-ins with all of our alumni to say, how's it going? What have you learned? What should you have learned from us that you're now learning now the hard way? And really using that to kind of really completely reshape the curriculum each time. And we have the advantage because our founder of this, Sean Outler, who runs diversity and inclusion for Macy's Inc., she founded it. Yeah. And she's the one that basically is shepherds it and all the iterations that make it to what it is today with a lot of ambition to make it better for the future.
Right, and today, throughout the whole conference, we've been talking about solutions. We've been talking about like, okay, so we have the data, we've talked the talk, what kind of solutions? So for anyone out in the audience who might be thinking about launching an accelerator for the aim of getting more Black-owned businesses or diverse founders, like what specific advice would you share based off of some of the feedback that you guys have received?
Yeah, the biggest feedback we've received is that, how do I start? How do I do this?
Yeah.
And, they generally have great ideas. They've got great products, and they're totally connected with their customer. I would tell you that's never the issue. We get this, we've 175, we probably interviewed about 1,500 to get to that 175. And it's a big decision about how do you make the choices to get to just this select group.
Right.
And they always have amazing connections to the DNA of their brand, to the needs of their community. So it's then how do you bring that to life? And it's just helping them conceptualize that. So in a lot of cases, they're totally sold there. We try and tailor the program to the individual businesses. It's not a cookie cutter approach. So when you look about half of the curriculum can be tailored to the individual company and their need. They may have an opportunity in social media, but they've got their balance sheet totally solved. So we try and make it bespoke to who those individuals are. And we look at, it started out, it was mostly women's apparel. Then it kind of went to beauty, then men's, then jewelry, then kids. We now have home involved with it. So it was it's been a journey for us.
What advice would you give to other retail chiefs who might be thinking about launching an accelerator, knowing that they want to, but it's like, where do I start?
Where do you start? Yeah, so I think it's got to be true to where your customer is and where you're going with that. So where are your products? And I think that sometimes in retail, it can be a sea of the sameness. So outside of your own private brands, you've got a lot of national brands that everybody has and enjoys. But this idea about having what is unique content that works for your customer and what does that look like? I think the merchandising strategy's got to drive, the solution of having diversity behind it. But I think every, retail chief is looking at this because you've got a consumer that is much more requiring of it than ever. And we've got to serve them, and it matters to them where the products were sourced, what the origin story of the product is, what's the DNA of the designer. It matters to the colleague who's helping you design it. That's going to become increasingly important.
Yeah.
So I would say that every retail CEO has got to have a strategy, and they got to put it in hyperdrive if they're behind.
So you mentioned people care about the materials or where a product is from, sustainability. That leads perfectly to that. And so as part of the Mission Everyone, Macy's has the goal of making sure that I believe 100% of your private label brands are preferred materials, which includes cotton, synthetics, wood-based materials.
All fibers, all materials by 2030.
By 2030. So in 8 years' time, if someone's walking into a Macy's or shopping online for your private label brands, they should expect.
They should expect that.
Got it. And so I guess the question then is, what other expansions do you see Macy's doing when it comes to sustainability? I know you guys have the partnership with ThredUp, online reseller.
Right.
We were talking earlier about how your 21-year-old daughter keeps you on the forefront when it comes to.
She doesn't buy retail.
She doesn't buy retail.
So, she's an audience of one, but and thank goodness that not all of her peer group is that way. But definitely, when you think about a Gen Z consumer, the whole idea about recycling of content is extremely important. So when I look at our sustainability, the one element about what we're doing with fiber, et cetera, but science-based targets and really living by those. Really important that we're improving the quality of life for the women and men who live in our or who are working in the factories that we produce all of our private brands in. So we have a big private brand apparatus. It's about 20% of our business. And so consolidating down to those factories that offer the most ethical standards and that basically are really working on really all the human quality, the rhythms of life that they're focused on. We are now working with a Fashion Makes Change, which is a nonprofit that's based here in the States, giving them grants along with other companies to be in those factories and to particularly improve the lives of women and the families that are in these particular factories. So that's something, when I look at our private brands, we have an end-to-end view of improving not only the quality of life, but also the sustainability of those products. So that's the other thing that we're working on. And you know, I would say with sustainability, we're in the early innings of this. You know, we have big ambition with it, but we got a long ways to go.
Anything on the horizon in the next year that you guys are thinking about expansion for the circular economy?
Yeah, what we're doing is when you think about, if you go to our website and you look at, we have basically a sustainability site lit on that kind of tells all of what we're doing. New brands coming up. So obviously this is a very, very important element for us. We launched a new private brand in the spring of 21 called Oak that's sustainable, fully sustainable. And, you know, expect more of that in terms of private brands that we create. In terms of the science-based targets of being really particular about exactly where we're going and all the measurables and how we're holding ourselves accountable. So you'll see that, you know, in all of our proxies and all that's coming up. So, you know, that's what you'll see in the next year.
Got it. As part of Mission Everyone, also you guys are thinking about ethnic diversity at the top level of your company, 30% by 2025. But I also know that you think about diversity more broadly in your C-suite, among your top leaders. Yeah. So can you talk to me a little bit more about how you lead as a leader when you think about diversity more broadly and surrounding yourself with people who don't look like you, think like you, all of those things?
Well, look, I think that at the end of the day, you need to have a team of talented colleagues that are serving these communities. And it's like that the idea about just saying that it's going to be a mirror is your ambition. Because I got to tell you, there's so many advantages that come from that pursuit. And this isn't a diversity question. This is really an inclusion and an equity conversation. It's this idea that when they do come, they are their full selves and they're contributing. They're fully comfortable in expressing what they know in what we do for the customers that we're seeking. And you know, this has been a journey for us. We have a couple of things that we do. One is that we take a culture pulse survey that is twice a year, and really looking at, we've always had a good culture. We have high engagement. 90% of our entire population take it. This last one that we just took, 50,000 were diverse colleagues, and they give us like a 91% in terms of all of the questions that you would expect would keep them in a company like ours, producing where we want them to. And so what we're always looking for are those colleagues that can take their experiences and make a difference in the business. So, you know, last week, we honored a colleague who was a buyer in our dress department. Her name is Keisha King. And she happened to be from one of the historical black sororities, one of the Divine Nine. And she came from that, and she was in the number 3 biggest sorority in the country. And, you know, she was going to a lot of events. And what she found in these 4 sororities was they all wear the exact color of their sorority. And they're looking for opportunities to find those colors in a retailer. So she basically went to her number 1 dress manufacturer and basically produced it and got that on all the social spaces, got that through her sorority network, is now working with it on suits, and has created a $10 million business that was otherwise not there. That we would not have looked to that had it not been for her leadership. We have countless examples of opportunities to say, hey, when you show up with your experiences, your perspective, you know, this is a company that wants to hear it, and we're going to enable you to be able to create it. And that's an example of really what I think of as inclusion and equity at work.
And how does it show up for you when it comes to leading with your identity as a diverse leader and making sure that everyone does feel like they can bring their full selves to work?
Yeah, you know, those of you who don't know that I'm gay, I came out in my early part of my career in 1980, it was actually 84 when I came out, but I came out in Macy's, California. And Macy's, California at that point, before Macy's consolidated, was 25 stores. And at that particular time, AIDS was starting to rage in San Francisco. It was a scary time for gay people. for not only your own personal health, but how it was perceived by others. And, it wasn't an option for me, and I didn't think I would ever have a future, but I needed to be my authentic, and I was who I was. And I don't think I'd be where I am today if it had not been at Macy's that I did that with. And I've been with this company for 38 years because it has always been a welcoming culture. My opportunity as the steward of it is really how to now steer that in productive ways. And so, I feel that when I looked at being a diverse leader, it gave me the sensibility to recognize, hey, how much by being authentic could that just unleash my comfort level in being myself at work and my ideas? And by doing authentic, that breeds trust. And when you have trust, you unlock so much in people's potential. So that's one of the things that we really test for, meaning we survey for, is how do people feel about being at work? And do they feel like they have to check their authentic self at the door, or can they bring their full experience and live their true self in the workplace? And we're making some good inroads on that. I feel like, we've got, now that needs to be channeled into productive ways to drive profitable growth.
Right. And as we wrap up, we've touched on a lot of initiatives that you guys have going. Who's accountable? Where does the buck stop?
Well, that's the beauty of, we're in transformation. So when you and I first connected, we were launching the Polaris strategy right before the pandemic in February of 2020. I think one thing we've learned through all that is, okay, execute. And with that, have a really clear strategy, have really clear initiatives, have very strong KPIs, and have the throat on each of the ends of that about who's accountable for it. And so, that is something, when I look at all the tenets of Mission Everyone, or all the tenets of Own Your Style, or 2 brand platforms we're launching at the same time, they've all got accountable leaders that are emboldened. They've got the decision-making rights. They've got the support that they need. And it's our job as senior leaders to help shepherd that through.
Jeff, well, thank you so much for walking us through and for sharing your story.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much. Appreciate you. Thank you so much, Jordan. Appreciate you so much.
All right. Well, that brings us to the end of day 1. Thank you all so much for joining us today. Appreciate you. What just amazing conversations. And I hope that all of us are activated to continue to put in the work. I want to thank our presenting sponsors today, Boston Consulting Group, Syndio, and TPG, for making this event possible. That's right. Yep. Round of applause. Yeah. If you'd like more information from our sponsors, please visit BloombergLive.com, Bloomberg Equality Summit, and visit the Resources tab on your screen. And most of all, thank you all for being such an engaged audience. Really appreciate your energy and your enthusiasm today. If you want to watch any part of this event, you can do so on demand by going to BloombergLive.com, Bloomberg Equality Summit. And we are not done. Day 2 takes place tomorrow. It is 100% virtual, so please do not show up here tomorrow. Team Bloomberg will not be here. But please join us for day 2. We have an exciting lineup for day 2. Speakers include John Barnes, the former footballer, Mary C. Daly, the president and CEO of the San Francisco Fed, my conversation with David Oyelowo. I will just say this. The last question I posed to him, his response was so passionate. My response was mic drop. So I highly, highly recommend you listen to our conversation. And we'll also have Gina Raimondo, Commerce Secretary, just to name a few. Again, thank you all so much. And let's head out for networking and cocktails. Thank you.